webinar is now being recorded. Everyone, my name is Karen Carlucci, Standards Training and Practices Manager with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline based here in New York City. And we welcome you to Lifeline's featured webinar for this month on raising LGBTQ awareness among crisis centers. While we're waiting, please again take a moment to answer that poll question if you have not already. Now, the STP division aims to deliver at least one webinar per month to our network, and today's webinar is focused on LGBTQ awareness. We have 4 terrific speakers that I'm excited to introduce in a bit, but first I'm going to just hide this poll question for now. Let's look at the objectives for today, what we're going to cover. We will have an introduction on the importance of LGBTQ awareness in a crisis center. There will be an overview of some terminology throughout the presentation, touching on serving LGBTQ youth as well as adults. And then we will share some training resources as well as a few other resources that are relevant. And you can always refer back to this information in the future on the slides themselves, which I will share next week in the Lifeline weekly announcements. So these objectives will be covered by all 4 of our terrific speakers today, which I will introduce in full more when each presenter is approaching their segment. But for now, we can see that we will start with Dominic Abordo, who's right here in the Lifeline with us in New York City. We will then transition to Lillian Rivera, who's at the Hetrick Martin Institute, also here in New York. We'll then transition to Chris Bright, who is with the Trevor Project out on the West Coast. And finally, we'll hear from Mark Davis, who is on our Lifeline Consumer Survivor Subcommittee. All right, so let's get right into the material. We have a lot to cover, and we expect that this webinar will go close to 2:30 today. My first speaker, as I mentioned, is Dominic here with the Lifeline. He's program coordinator. He's been involved in LGBT advocacy and supportive services both domestically and abroad since 2000. There are some highlights that include co-managing an LGBT cooperative housing space in Berkeley, California, serving as a sexual health specialist for the LGBT communities in central and northeastern Japan, and interning in one of New York City's largest and most well-known LGBTQ supportive organizations. Most recently, Dominic has channeled his energy into promoting healthy socialization among the LGBTQ community through sports via New York City nonprofits such as Cheer New York and Gotham Volleyball. So I know Dominic is good at volleyball. Dominic, you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. How are you all doing today? Thank you, Karen, for having me as one of your speakers and panelists today. I'm very, very happy to be part of this webinar. So just to give you guys a little bit of background information, I just wanted to kind of set the scene for the importance of this webinar before we turn to our 3 specialists today. So if you look at this slide, you notice there's not a lot of text on it. I will be working through this graphic going counterclockwise, starting in the center and then going to the left. So just here are a few things that I want you to know. First things first, I'm not sure how much background information we have, or how much background information you guys have, but LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer or questioning, but I will leave the definitions of that to our next speaker who will go into much more detail. So some statistics. Approximately 10% of youth 21 years of age or younger identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning. Unfortunately, due to this, or despite this 1 to 10 ratio, an alarming 40% of homeless youth in the United States are LGBTQ. That's according to the Williams Institute and the National Coalition for the Homeless. The leading cause of this homelessness is family rejection of sexual orientation or gender identity, which is one of the major risk factors of this community. Other risk factors include lack of familial support, lack of social support from peers, friends, etc., struggles with sexual orientation and gender identity, and other such things. This puts them at greater risk for depression and consequently for suicidal ideation and behavior, which is part of what we are focusing on for today's webinar. And so just to give you guys some more percentages, approximately 4.6 or 5% of the general U.S. population attempts suicide at least once in their life. That said, among lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals, only the LGB part of this equation, that percentage increases to somewhere between 10 and 20% depending on the age group. Generally speaking, youth between the ages of, say, 14 or 15 to 25 tend to be in the higher range, somewhere around 20%, and then adults in their mid-20s to their late 50s or so are on the lower end of the spectrum, and then the percentage increases again for those who identify as senior citizens, so 65 and older. And that's 2 to 4 times that of their heterosexual counterparts, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, as well as the Youth Suicide Prevention Program. So then moving along to the other part of the graphic here, I think it's very important to separate transgender from the rest of the equation because of their significantly higher rate of suicidal ideation and attempts. Believe it or not, there are increased risk factors in the transgender community around gender identity and things of that nature, which puts them at an alarming 41% of transgender people who attempt suicide at least once in their life. Some studies actually suggest as high as 45 or 50% as well. And what's even more concerning is that 1 in 3 transgender individuals actually completes suicide, according to statistics from VOActive. So that said, we hope that through this webinar, our presenters can help provide our Lifeline Crisis Centers with some more useful tools for working with and supporting these high-risk populations in terms of mental health and suicide prevention.
Thank you so
Karen,
much,
I'm going to turn it over
Dominic.
to you. No problem.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction and for setting the stage and giving us some context of why this is an important area for all of us to learn more about, as we are here on the Lifeline specifically to respond to all callers who present with all types of needs, all ages, all backgrounds, and if they do share personal information about sexual orientation or gender identity, etc., the things that we'll cover today, we want to be as sensitive and attuned to those needs as possible as it's relevant. So thank you again. So let's transition to our next featured speaker. It is Lillian Rivera, and I'll tell you a little bit about Lillian. Let's go to her material. With a decade's worth of experience in youth development, Ms. Rivera is currently the Director of Advocacy and Capacity Building at the Hetrick Martin Institute, known as HMI, the nation's oldest and largest LGBTQ youth-serving agency with sites in New York City and Newark, New Jersey. Ms. Rivera has appeared on numerous media outlets, including Christina, CNN en Español, and NBC Latino, offering her expertise on best practices in working with LGBTQ youth. She has had articles on her work and her life as a Latina lesbian mom published on the Huffington Post and the Feminist Wire. Prior to assuming her current role, Ms. Rivera served as Director of After-School Services, the largest direct service area at HMI. She received her BA in Theater and MPH from Rutgers University. So welcome, Lillian. We're happy to have you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Wishing everyone a beautiful day today. I'm really happy to be here today to share. And the first thing I'd like to share before we even get to the content is I really want to open up this space for folks to be able to ask questions that folks really have but just feel they don't want to ask those questions because they'll offend. And it's probably within this context where we're creating a learning environment that we can suspend those rules of offending folks to be able to get those questions answered. So when we are engaged with someone on a lifeline, those aren't sort of barriers to our communicating with them. But in your service today, we are here to answer those questions. So with that said, Patrick Martin Institute, we're the nation's oldest and largest LGBTQ youth-serving agency. We were established in 1979. We can go to the next slide. And we were founded by two people, Dr. Damien Martin and Marie Hetrick. And they started the organization really as an advocacy organization with their friends. And in their living rooms, like most grassroots organizations begin, and they named it the Institute for the Protection of Lesbian and Gay Youth because they heard about a young person who was in a shelter who was assaulted and was thrown out because had he not been so gay, this wouldn't have happened to him. And as concerned adults in the LGBT community, they thought they needed to respond. They were also instrumental in having homosexuality removed from the DSM. They were also key partners in developing SAGE, which is a senior LGBT group here in the United States, and other organizations in our movement. And we take that to heart and continue to lead around working with LGBTQ youth. And in terms of our historical timeline, we were started in 1979, and a few years after we established an office. In that office, the staff at the time, which were mainly volunteer folks, were providing counseling to young people. We're learning about their stories, about their histories, in order to do advocacy on their behalf. And young people started in the office during the day when they should have been in school. And that's when our founders found out that high schools weren't a safe space for LGBTQ youth. So in 1985, they established the Harvey Milk School, and which is how most people know us. And in 2003, the Department of Education of New York City came in and made Harvey Milk High School a fully accredited transfer high school. Most people know us through the Harvey Milk High School, but it's a very small school. There's only about 70 young people in that school, and our community-based organization serves about 2,000 young people each year. So, and I'll talk a little bit about the services that we provide to young people, but if you could imagine, nationwide we have Boys and Girls Clubs, we have YMCA, that's sort of what our service provision looks like, specifically tailored to meet the needs of LGBTQ youth. And who are those youth? They are LGBTQ youth between the ages of 13 to 24. They're primarily young people of color living in poverty, and they travel from many, many zip codes throughout this area. And we found, establishing our second site in New Jersey, that the same is true. We had young people in New Jersey from over 20 zip codes. We can go to the next slide. And our program, the HMI program, membership is the model. Young people become members. They come to us and through an intake process become members of the organization, and they commit to being part of our community that is really about creating an inclusive environment for all people. So young people, we serve primarily LGBTQ youth, but have a good percentage of young people who are straight identified and are welcomed here, because everyone's welcomed here, and that's the model that ideally we would want in all spaces for young people, that all young people are welcome. And then in terms of our services, we provide services across quite a few areas. We do health and wellness, so we do HIV testing, we do nutritional work, STI screenings, we connect young people to medical care, and we help young people get entitlements around health care. We prepare young people for the workforce through our job readiness. academic enrichment. We provide young people with scholarships. They have access to tutors on a daily basis. Within arts and culture, we do all of the visual and performing arts. Our member navigation team works on ensuring that young people are able to negotiate systems and are getting the correct services for what their needs are. Our services to homeless youth, we go out each day and do outreach, street outreach to young people, and provide on-site concrete services so young people have access to clothing, shoes, washer, dryer, shower, food every day. And we do mental health counseling and case management. We do individual, we do group work, we do family work. And then all of this all comes together through our Cafe HMI, where young people each night come together. We all come together as a community and sit down and break bread together. In terms of our framework, we are really invested in a trauma-informed framework, and we do this because of the life circumstances of the young people that we work with. They have experienced significant amount of trauma, and we want our space to be a place where they have the opportunity to heal and grow, and there's no re-traumatization based primarily on their sexual orientation or gender identity. But because we live in New York City, we also, of course, consider the multiple marginalizations that young people in poverty, youth of color are experiencing every day. And our trauma-informed practice with LGBTQ youth is really based on our knowledge and our experience understanding the life events that impact LGBTQ youth, that create psychological outcomes, the abuse that young people experience, the neglect that they experience, sometimes based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, sometimes on those other issues. We ensure that young people are able to engage in a system in a way where they're emotionally secure and physically secure. That's one of the tenets of our work. In the department that I work, the advocacy and capacity building, we work externally, so we work to create safety outside. But when young people are here, we're sure to, safety is sort of the place where we're always working with. And we achieve this, obviously, by really thoughtful and mindful trauma-informed practices that we're constantly developing and evolving as adolescent populations often are in transition, right? Of course, adolescence is the age of transition, and within our young people, we have seen all of those transitions, and we see trends. How do those trends manifest themselves, and how do we inform our practice based on the trends that we're feeling with, we're witnessing with the young people we're working with? And in terms of some of what does that look like in terms of the young people we work with, the sort of the external reactions to trauma that we see in our work with young people because of the lives that they've managed to navigate are interpersonal conflicts, hypervigilance, and hypervigilance around lots and lots of things, right? Hypervigilance around food, hypervigilance around access to resources, hypervigilance around even things like that are really important, like names and pronouns and clothing, things that are affirming. Aggressive responses, and we know why that's true as a survival mechanism. School avoidance and truancy, which is really logical. For us, it seems logical that young people would avoid places where they are not safe. Substance use and abuse to self-medicate around the pain of trauma, and self-injuring behaviors. So those are some of the things that we've seen as red flags with young people who have experienced trauma, and things that we're really mindful of in our model and how it translates. And this may seem really clinical, but this seeps into all areas of our practice, and we ensure that all practitioners within our service delivery are trained around trauma-informed care. But this year we've gone a step further and have trained the entire staff of the entire agency. So our facilities folks, our HR folks, our finance folks, everyone understands sort of the model that we're using in order to ensure that the model is integrated throughout the system. So with that said, I thought we'd begin the conversation around what do these letters mean, right? Exploring the LGBTQITS spectrum. And I threw in some extra letters that we often don't hear when we hear about the LGBT community in order to expand. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, and queer. Questioning is particularly important that we point out because from our perspective, we work with adolescents, and it's an appropriate time developmentally to be questioning identity and to be moving towards what feels authentic for them. And then queer is a term that has historically been understood as derogatory, but in this case, some people have taken over that term as an identity and feel really comfortable and empowered to use that identity. Intersex is a term used to explain folks, and I have more of a detailed conversation about that later on. And Two-Spirit is a term that comes from Native folks. So if we move into our next slide, I will ask that participants engage with me in a visual, I'm going to take you through a visualization. So if you would imagine yourself as an adolescent and you are thinking about or planning for a really important event. And this event you have been planning for 2 years. And you have saved all the money that you have earned in your part-time job for this event. And for this event, because you saved so much money, you're even able to rent a limousine for yourself. So you have the most amazing outfit on, and you are wearing the most amazing shoes, and we have the perfect hairstyle, and you feel so amazing. And you go to this venue, and as you're approaching the venue, you hear your favorite song playing. So when you walk into the venue, you see a person across the room who you have had a crush on for 2 years. You have a physical response, right? So that's what we call, and if we advance to the next slide, sexual orientation. So if we've suspended our, if we've been able to sort of take in that visualization and go through that little journey, as you picture that person within that venue, you might have had assigned a sex or a gender to that person, right? And the feelings that would come up are feelings of attraction that you don't control. They just happen naturally, and they can impact how we react with someone. That's how we define sexual orientation. Feelings of attraction one cannot control. Those are really simplify. It's a simple definition, but it works for our purposes. And then our next concept is sexual behavior. What do you do with this person you feel this attraction to, right? What do you choose to engage in? You can choose to engage in behavior, or you cannot. And sometimes those behaviors will coincide with attraction and sometimes they don't. And then our next concept is sexual identity. And this is what one chooses to call oneself, right? And we come to this identity based on an understanding of our attractions, the world we live in, other things that impact us, and then we can come to that identity. We may label that identity or we may not. We may use a label that is prescribed in society for us or we may not, right? So we have the LGBTQ, and then someone asked about the A. Yes, there's also asexual, there's also advocate, there's also ally. There's also pansexual, right? There are lots and lots of identities. The L, the G, the B, the T, the L, the G, and the B are not the end-all and be-all of sexual identities. There are many others that we may not have language for as of yet. So folks may ask, what is asexual, right? Asexual is someone who does not engage, may have romantic relationships with folks, but just doesn't engage in a sexual relationship with other people. May have emotional or romantic attractions to folks, but not necessarily. So I think what to take away from it is that sometimes these words become deterrents for us to connect to people. What's really important is that people tell us what their identity is, and we maybe tease out what that means to them, so we have a clear understanding of what words are important to them and how their identity is formed and what's important to them. And I'm not just diminishing the L, the G, or the B, or the P in any way, shape, or form, or the A. I'm just saying those words sometimes mean things to certain people, and we have to know what the meaning and the context is of those words in order to be able to connect and accurately see what that means to people. So what's the difference? Sex is a term that refers to biological makeup, right? It's only on the basis of biology, and it's usually assigned at birth. So a baby is born. The physician will look at the child's anatomy, and she will say, this is a boy, or this is a girl, based on what they see. Gender. Gender is a term that is socially constructed, and it prescribes specific roles to the biology, right? So if this person is born male, their gender, if this person is born male, their gender should be masculine. Sexual orientation, as I said earlier, is about attraction, sexually, romantically, for someone else. And sexual identity is how one chooses to language their sexual identity, right? How they identify. And gender identity is the way one chooses, or society chooses, a particular gender to a person or a group. And if we go to our next slide, this is sort of what we're born, raised, understanding. Someone's biological sex, the hormones, genitalia, sex characteristics, male, or female. Gender expression should be aligned, masculine or feminine. Sexual orientation, attracted to women. So this misses a lot of people, right? It probably misses most of us. And then in the next slide, we see something a little more inclusive, right? So we have assigned sex. So the physician assigns sex to a young person, so a baby being born, male or female. And then their identity around gender is how they see themselves. When I look in the mirror, do I see myself as a man? Do I see myself as a woman? Do I see myself as a person beyond the binary, beyond man or woman? And my gender expression is how I take that understanding of myself and express it. How do I dress? How do I move in the world? How do I engage with people? Do I do it in a way that we expect masculine folks to do it? Do I do it in a way that we expect feminine people to do it? Do I do it in a way that transcends those limitations, right? So gender expression is usually where people will place us in a box depending on how we show up in the world. So I can present in what's traditionally understood to be masculine presentation in terms of my dress and my behavior and how I move in the world and how I talk. And someone may use male pronouns with me. Unknowingly, I identify as a woman. So they might have missed the mark there because my expression was communicating something, and that's not how I identified. So that's why understanding people's perspective on their identity is really important. And then we put sexual orientation at the bottom, and I put it at the bottom because it has nothing to do with our gender identity or gender expression. Those are two different constructs, right? So we have men can be attracted to women. They can be attracted to men. They can be attracted to both. They can be attracted to neither. They can be attracted to people who don't identify as men or women. So I think that's why we created this in a way that is multifaceted, right? And I think we could even have, these are all straight lines, I think we could have sort of bent lines or squiggly lines that I think would get more at what gender really is. And then if we advance to the next slide, this is a genderbread person, and I love the genderbread person because it puts things in really simple things. Identity is between our ears and our brain. This is where we, fall around identity. This is where it's created. Attractions in our heart. Sex, which is really basic, and I actually changed. They had biological sex. I put assigned sex because the difference is someone can have a biological sex, which does not correlate with who they are, and they still have a biology, right? And then expression is how we move in the world, how we show the world who we are. And sometimes we can get some clues about folks by their expression, and sometimes we can't, and that's okay. And that's where the opportunity to learn is. And then in our next slide, and the reason that we're spending a lot of time specifically on gender and the construct of gender is because I think as a society we're in a place where we are starting to have these conversations, and it's really important that we do have those conversations and that we are being rigorous around our understanding of gender. So we know that in our world, we have transgender people. Now, this construct around language is a new one. Transgender people, that is not a new concept. We have had transgender people. We have had third gender people in society for a long, long time. Now, this is a great question. Do we address the transgender people by him or her, or should we ask them what they call themselves when it comes to transgender? That's a beautiful question, and the question would be, we ask them, what's your name and what pronouns do you prefer? So when we meet a young person here at HMR, we say, hi, I'm Lillian. I use my preferred gender pronouns are she and her. what are your preferred gender pronouns? Now, sometimes for folks who are gender variant or gender nonconforming, or as we like to language it, gender liberated, this might be the first time that they're asked that question. So we may need to spend some time talking to them about that I respect them and who they are, and I want them to have the freedom in choosing what pronouns are affirming to them and which pronouns they would like me to use with them. With young people, it is sort of a process. With folks who are living in their authentic self, they'll know exactly how to answer that question. So transgender is an umbrella term for people whose identity or gender expression does not match their sex assigned at birth. Transsexual in specific, that word is someone whose assigned sex is not aligned with their gender identity, and they may desire to pursue medical intervention. Not all transgender people do pursue medical intervention around hormones or sex-affirming surgery. So it's important to know that the biology of a trans person is probably the least important thing. What their body is composed of is, if they need support around that, of course, that's something that we would want to provide, right? If they need resources to sort of explore how they want their body to align around how they feel, absolutely we provide resources. But in meeting a trans person, we wouldn't want to ask questions about their body. I personally don't like people asking me questions about my body, so that's something that we wouldn't engage in. Someone who's intersex is someone who's born with a variation around sex chromosomes, gonads, genitalia, and the physician at birth may not know how to classify this baby, and sometimes people will, there'll be medical intervention at birth. The family and the physician will decide whatever genitals the young person or reproductive organs have more of. So intervene at that level and assign one. We're learning more and more that it's probably not the best course to take. And intersex community is a community that's really invisible. So someone asked what's going too far in terms of transgender people. I'm assuming that's around questioning, having questions about who they are. Definitely talking about body is, if we initiate that conversation, is really not where we want to go. If we have questions about trans people, it will probably be better if we go online and get resources from reliable sources to sort of help us understand where sort of the trajectory of a trans person is. When we're talking to trans people, we would need to have them lead that conversation. What is the term you just used to describe gender identity? It was very beautifully affirming. And I think you were talking about gender-liberated young people who go beyond the binary. So genderqueer people are people who don't identify with the gender binary, and that's really important. Thanks for that question. Gender binary, when I say gender binary, I'm talking about male and female. And as we know in our society, male and female binary hasn't always been supportive to all of us. And there are people who live beyond that and are able to negotiate these constructs in different ways for themselves. The thing with trans people, gender liberated people, is that because they're living beyond the binary, they're more likely to be targets of violence. So that's really important when thinking about this community. A trans woman is someone who is assigned male at birth and lives their life in congruence with their authentic female gender identity. And a trans man is a person who's assigned female at birth and live their lives in congruence with their authentic male gender identity. And then Two-Spirit is a person with both male and female characteristics, which comes from some Native American cultures, not all of them. And at this point, I'd like to thank everyone for being so attentive and for the wonderful questions. I know at the end we'll have more time for questions. And please consider me as a resource. My email, and I know the slides will be sent out to everyone. I'd love to continue the conversation and support people as we learn together.
Thank you so much, Lillian. Thank you for being available to present to us today and for making sure that we had access to this valuable information. This is a great educational foundation that you provided, so we really appreciate it. I know that Mike Dunn had a question that I believe our next speaker might also be able to speak to, but I just wanted to make sure you saw it, Lillian, about checking in on the appropriate questions to ask related to sex, gender, orientation, identity, etc., in collecting certain demographic information on a hotline. Did you want to just say anything about that, and then we'll move on to Chris?
I'd love to. I think as many options as possible would be the best in terms of demographic, with what makes sense in terms of the limited time that you have, right? So we ask assigned sex at birth, and then we ask gender identity, because we acknowledge that those might be different. In terms of sexual orientation and sexual identity, I wouldn't necessarily ask about sexual identity. I would just ask about sexual orientation. And in asking about assigned sex and then asking about gender identity, we would get at the gender piece. So we would understand that someone was assigned to this, and then they identify as this now, and this is how. The one other thing that I would ask right away are, what are your preferred gender pronouns? So I have a clear understanding going into the conversation what pronouns are the best for this person and what feels the most affirming to this person, because I understand that on a phone, through a conversation, someone's voice may have a specific tone and tenor that may place me, that I will jump to like male pronouns or female pronouns, and then offering the non-gendered option as well as they and them. When folks have questions about which to use, I always use they and them, and this is a skill that you have to practice and integrate into your sort of language, because we don't automatically talk about people as they and them in the third person, but it does avoid us offending people by using pronouns that are incongruent with their identity. So those are some of the things that I think of.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that answer, Lillian. So I am conscious of the time. We're going to get to our next speaker. And if we didn't get to your question, you can certainly bring it to our attention later, or you can email one of the speakers directly, or of course me, and I can help get the information for you and connect you to the right person. So we are now going to hear from Chris Bright. Chris is currently the Crisis Service Trainer for the Trevor Lifeline. He is responsible for training new crisis counselors at the Trevor Project on the Lifeline. He has been with the Trevor Lifeline since 2011. Welcome, Chris. We're happy to have you from the West Coast.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a 101 sort of introduction to Trevor, and Lillian and I have a couple of things that are similar, but I think it's good to have as much conversation around these topics as possible. So here's a bit of an overview of what I will be talking about. I'm going to let you know a little bit about the Trevor Project, why we exist, understanding LGBTQ youth and the risk factors and protective factors that we really should be looking out for with LGBTQ youth. And then in answering some of your questions, I'll talk about what the call center culture is like specifically for an LGBTQ youth suicide hotline. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. One What is the Trevor Project? Okay, so next slide. The Trevor Project is a leading national organization providing crisis intervention, suicide prevention services to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning youth. So we have a couple of different programs. The next slide will talk a little bit about some of them. The Trevor Lifeline is the nation's only 24/7 crisis intervention and suicide prevention hotline specifically for LGBTQ youth. We're open 24/7, 365, and we are really the only resource out there that is on the national scale for this particular community. However, we typically enjoy and want to be able to partner with the National Line and other lifelines because we know that LGBTQ young people really are going to reach out for resources just like anybody else would. And we really all should have an ability to sort of navigate these topics together. A couple of our other programs are Trevor Space. It's sort of like Facebook, but for LGBTQ youth. So nobody is on the site who is over the age of 24, and it's also monitored. So we do make sure that there isn't any sort of cyberbullying or things like that going on. We sort of have an algorithm that looks for key phrases or things that could be inappropriate, and we make sure that it is really a very safe space for young people to get together and talk about who they are, what their identities are, and what they're going through. This year, I think we passed the 110,000 mark, so we have 110,000 active members on Trevor Space, and that's amazing. We also have something called Trevor Chat. So I know a lot of your call centers also have chat programs, and this is sort of a version of our lifeline that is for folks who want to chat. I will highlight here that Trevor Chat is a great resource for young trans people who don't feel comfortable talking. And the reason is because a lot of times folks feel like their voice doesn't exactly match their gender identity. And so they may feel more comfortable speaking on Trevor Chat. And that's something that I just wanted to point out, that we've noticed that there is definitely a larger number of transgender people who reach out to us via our chat programs than our phone lifeline. And we think it's probably because it just feels more comfortable, more anonymous, more safe. Next, thank you. So why the Trevor Project? Why do we exist? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges that are specifically facing LGBTQ youth. And we're going to separate trans youth from LGBT. Just sort of like Lillian did earlier, the statistics really are a little bit different from one population to the next. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among 15 to 24-year-olds. So it's very important that we do have resources out there that focus on LGBTQ youth. LGBT youth are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their heterosexual peers. Next slide. In a national survey of transgender individuals, 41 reported attempting, sorry, I'm like multitasking and reading the chats all at once. Okay. 41% attempted suicide compared to 1.6 of the general population, with rates raising for those who lost their job due to bias, 55%, were harassed or bullied in school, 51%, had a low household income, or were the victim of physical assault, 61%, and sexual assault, 64%. Ashley says, sometimes they don't like the name they were given. Is what I was meaning. I meant in the case that they are not comfortable with the name that they were given. Yeah, so that's a great point that I would be happy to touch on as well, that a lot of folks are assigned, not only are they assigned a gender at birth, but they're also assigned a name at birth. And for a lot of folks who call the line, they may bring up the topic of gender identity, or maybe they may broach the topic of being a transgender person or having a trans identity. And one of the most powerful things that you can do as a counselor is ask the caller if there is a name that they would prefer you use while talking with them. You may be the very first person to ever actually use that person's real name, their true name. and respect their identity in that way. So that's actually a great way to build rapport and make sure that you are really, really respecting them. And the truth is, when you're talking to someone, very rarely do you use your pronouns when you're talking to that person. You use their name. And so their name is going to be the most powerful thing that you can use to sort of connect with them. So LGBTQ youth who come from highly rejecting families are more than 8 times as likely to have attempted suicide than their LGBT peers who reported low levels of family rejection. More than 80% of LGBTQ youth report verbal abuse, while 15% report physical abuse at school. And more than one-third will lose friends through coming out. Increased victimization and losing friends both predict negative mental health outcomes, including substance use and suicide. These statistics are important because we know that compared to the general population, these are very high. We have a program that we've sort of transitioned into a newer program that's sort of like a resource center called the Trevor Support Center online. But that was based off of a program that we used to have called Ask Trevor. And that's where young people would write in letters to the Trevor Project. And this is an example of a letter that we received. So it says, I came out in 2011. Now my dad treats me different and always threatens he is going to kick me out and put me on the streets. Sometimes I feel like I was a mistake to my dad, and yes, sometimes I wish I was dead. So then maybe my dad won't have to deal with anything, and I won't have to be shut out of his life. So you can see even this letter from a young person, a lot of their stress and a lot of the things that they're going through have to do with rejection and lack of family support. And so that's something that we want to highlight because it really is a common factor that really does affect many LGBTQ youth who are considering suicide. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about understanding LGBTQ youth. So sex is a medical term referring to genetic, biological, hormonal, or physical characteristics, which are used to classify an individual as female, male, or intersex at birth. Lillian covered this, but I do want to point out that in some cases, especially for folks within the intersex community, which oftentimes goes undiagnosed when young people are first born, the sex assigned at birth is also something that can be somewhat constructed. It's really hard to figure out exactly what combination of hormones and genitalia and physical characteristics equal male, female, or intersex. And so it's very important for us to acknowledge that to some extent, even sex, biological sex is socially constructed. And gender, in the same way, is a social construct based on emotional, behavioral, or cultural expectations attached to a person's assigned sex. These two things go hand in hand oftentimes with folks within the trans community who are struggling with the gender that they were assigned at birth or the sex that they were assigned at birth. And comparing that to actually who they really are, who they identify as now, and what that means for them. Gender identity is an inner sense of being man, male, woman, female, butch, femme, two-spirit, genderqueer, bigender, or another configuration of gender regardless of one's physical anatomy. There are many, many, many different types of gender, and there's no way we could go over all the different gender identities that exist during this short training. But what I will say is that it's okay if somebody were to acknowledge to you, like, oh, I identify as a gender that you're not familiar with, to ask them sort of what that means for you. Gender expression, so the communication of gender. This may be the communication of one's gender identity, or it may not be. Gender expression could be the way someone sort of dresses or the way that they express their gender. Sometimes folks will express a gender that is either more male or female because they feel safer. So gender expression doesn't always match one's gender identity, and that's really important to understand that safety does play a big role in the way that someone chooses to express their gender. Next slide. Speaking with transgender youth. So use the name and pronoun the individual uses for themselves. Avoid improper terms. Things like tranny and transsexual are inappropriate, and they definitely should not be used not only on the line and with the individual, but in the call center, in your communities. It's really important that we learn to use language appropriately, regardless of where we are and who we're with. So I do also want to highlight this idea that a lot of people are like, oh, it's really hard to figure out exactly what sort of pronouns I should use. I'm not sure, if I can remember that person's pronouns. And I want to encourage you that if you can learn somebody's name, or even if you can't, you know at least how important a name is to an individual. It's really important to learn their pronouns and to respect those pronouns, because using someone's name and pronouns correctly can be one of the most affirming things that you can do for them. You may have heard a term called PGP, preferred gender pronoun. It's okay to ask an individual what their pronouns are. And I want to encourage you in appropriate ways and in appropriate spaces to have that conversation. Ashley has a question. What can be another way I, as a counselor, can connect with that person other than using their name? Well, there's a certain level of competency that a transgender caller might really just appreciate, that you're familiar with certain terms they're using and that they don't have to explain different parts of the transgender experience to you. So that's one way that you can make them feel more comfortable. The other way is actually to not overly focus on the idea that an individual is transgender. So, for example, just because someone says, hey, I'm transgender, if the presenting problem has something to do with or is something that's completely unrelated to their gender identity, then you don't need to overly focus on their gender identity or assume that they're automatically unhappy or experiencing oppression just because of their gender identity. So one way to connect with them can be to sort of just focus on what they presented when they called and what they sort of had to say. Let's see. But speaking of the transgender youth experience and things that you could become more familiar with, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the idea of gender dysphoria. This is the idea that your body doesn't match your gender identity. And so there's different parts of your body that can be really frustrating for you and maybe overwhelming. It can cause depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. We know that young people who suffer from gender dysphoria are more likely to attempt suicide. They are more likely to suffer from depression, and it's a very, very serious topic. If somebody were to present the idea to you that maybe their breasts make them feel very upset, or they really wish that they had certain body parts that they currently don't feel like they have, all of these things can be wrapped up in this sort of conversation around gender dysphoria, and oftentimes the best thing that you can encourage someone who is suffering from gender dysphoria to do is to seek medical help. However, that's very difficult to do with young people who don't have support from their family. There is an organization called TYEF. You can write that down, Trans Youth Equality Foundation. And they will actually send out binders for free to any young person who wants one under the age of 18. A binder is something that someone will put over their chest to make their breast appear flatter and more, or less curvy, I should say. And if a young person were to reach out to TYEF and ask for that, they could send that anonymously. They could send it to a friend's house or somewhere where the young person's parents might not know. And the reason why this is so important is actually because some young people who are suffering from gender dysphoria will use ACE bandages to wrap their chest, but that's actually extremely dangerous. It can cause infection, it can cause rashes, bruising, and actually broken ribs. So it's really, really important that young people have access to healthy and safe ways to navigate gender dysphoria. We also know that trans youth are more likely to be marginalized by their peers just because they may have a different experience growing up. Maybe they go through puberty slightly differently. Maybe they have to transition while they are still with lots of friends who knew them the way that they had been assigned at birth versus their true identity, and that can be very difficult for folks. There's also a fear of violence. Trans women are often afraid of just walking down the street because the amount of trans women who get murdered every year in this country and also just the whole world is a staggering number, and it's truly, truly sad. And violence towards the transgender community is a huge reason why folks consider suicide and depression is rampant within the community, because it's just very difficult to navigate sort of your daily life when that's what you're struggling with, or that's the concerns that you're facing. Also, concerns around medical transitioning. I put that up, but I also want to be clear that not all transgender people want to transition, medically speaking. It's never appropriate to ask a transgender person, about a surgery or something like that and assume that every trans person would have a medical procedure, because having a medical procedure doesn't make you trans or not trans. So it's important to consider not broaching those topics with a trans person unless they first can confide in you or open up to you about that topic. Implications of being trans for hopes and dreams. So some people aren't able to get a job just because they're trans, and in many states they can just be fired. Maybe it's difficult to start a family or to navigate relationships. Apprehension in dating and relationships, feeling like you have to come out to someone as trans before you're even allowed to date them. Issues of passing, and passing's in quotes. The idea that you may or may not pass as the gender that you identify with is a huge struggle that folks within the trans community face. And also being clocked, so somebody thinking, oh, I believe that this person is transgender, and then sort of policing what spaces are acceptable for them to be in or not. You may have heard the term gender policing when it comes to restrooms, not allowing a transgender person to have access to the restroom that they feel most comfortable with. Next slide. Issues around coming out in general. Coming out is going to be different for every person based on their social structure, the society, and the people around them. Coming out is a lifelong process, and it happens over and over in different places and in different ways. People are having to basically always come out because certain social standards are set as defaults for everybody. It's an internal process, but it's also an external process, and coming to terms with oneself can be a crisis issue for a lot of folks. Every person has multiple identities, and they intersect and affect their coming out process. If you're not familiar with the idea of intersecting identities, I encourage you to do some research and to better understand and empathize with folks who have certain intersecting identities that really affect their ability to have access to important resources. So implications for our practice. The risk of suicide is actually highest just before and just after the coming out process, which makes sense, right? Because there's so much stress involved before that process, and also the aftermath of that process. Maybe some folks have been kicked out of their house. Maybe people are really struggling with not having the resources that they need after coming out. And coming out must be kept private and confidential. Obviously, you can encourage people if they were to call and say, oh, I came out to my friend and now everyone at school knows. You can encourage them by saying, well, that's not really fair. That's not right that happened. I'm really sorry that happened to you. Coming out should have been something that was just between you and that individual, not between you and everyone at school. And last, help to create a safety plan for coming out. If somebody says that they want to come out, the response isn't just like, oh, great, you should totally do that. But in fact, you may want to explore with them, okay, well, what do you think might happen if you came out? And really work through that process with them. Because for some people, thinking through that process may reveal that it isn't exactly a safe time or environment for them to come out in that moment. Okay, that is my section. If y'all have questions, there'll be time at the end. And then that's my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any specific questions that we don't have time to address now.
Thank you so much, Chris, for another thorough presentation. A lot of good material. We really wanted to squeeze in a lot of this information for you all today. So yes, please chat in your question if you'd like now, and then you can reach Chris or any of the other folks at their email addresses, or of course me, if we don't have time. So let's move on to our next speaker, who I'm very happy to introduce and tell you a little bit about, Mark Davis. Mark has worked in the mental health consumer survivor peer civil rights movement for 30 years. He is founding president of the Pennsylvania Mental Health Consumers Association and in the forefront of mental health, substance use, suicide prevention, service system reform with a focus on LGBT needs. He is founding facilitator of the Pink and Blues Philadelphia LGBT peer-run support group and co-founder of Keystone Pride Recovery Initiative. For 10 years, he has also served on the Lifeline Consumer Survivor Subcommittee. As our final speaker, in his own words, Mark will present from lived experience regarding considerations and needs of LGBT people. Welcome, Mark. We're happy to have you.
Thanks, Karen. Hello, hello, hello. We've had so far the Evelyn Wood speed hearing instructions, and there have been, I'm the fourth, and we each had 15 minutes, so I'm going to have to really talk fast to get my 15 minutes of fame, I guess, or 15 minutes of information in, so bear with me. Telling our stories is so vital and important. I'll say in the forefront, not about us, without us. We are the people living with, we are the people experiencing the situation. Historically, systems, providers, governments, all kinds of people that do for people are essentially leaving us out of the picture. And it's vital that we become a part of it. It's important from my life experience to name, claim, tame, and frame the situation, which really includes any life situation, all of us as human beings. When I found out that there was such a thing as bipolar 2 that I call the sequel, it put a name to what I had been experiencing undiagnosed for years after multiple institutionalization, shock treatments, homelessness, experimental drug therapy, addiction, just the whole laundry list of experiences we go through to get to that point. And coming to the terms of claiming what it is and learning how to tame it, whatever that might be, as an individual choice, and in partnership with our support team, whether they be peers, friends, family, allies, professionals, and to be able to frame it like we would a diploma. I'm a graduate of Community Mental Health Services in 1984, and I frame that in pride that I made it through that system and on to a journey of recovery and a journey of, after being told I would never work again, to prove them wrong, and have been in the forefront of the mental health consumer survivors peers civil rights movement, as explained. I'm a person, as I say in the next slide, I'm a person first, and I'm living with bipolar 2. I'm not bipolar, as I wouldn't be prostate cancer that I survived, as I wouldn't be any other label, but society loves to call us by our diagnosis, and it's important to get that language out of our head and see us as people first living with, or surviving from, or surviving life situation and recovering from. I'm a person in recovery from addictions of drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, and soda pop, and that has been a journey in itself. I've lived with HIV since testing positive September 27, 1988. I'm a suicide attempt survivor. I'm a suicide loss survivor after the the death of my sister Jennifer 20 years ago, April 3rd. And life is constantly recovering from the various conditions. I'm proud and thrilled to be alive, surviving the AIDS epidemic at its worst, and to be able to experience and not really suffer or deal with the complications from age. I'm moving into the generation of experiencing aging issues, and that's a long laundry list of conditions and experiences. And so it's been a long-term struggle, long-term challenges and successes. I could go on and on with my story. Many people have heard me go on and on, so I'll leave it at that and underline that we're people first, we're surviving, we're in recovery or recovering from. In terms of sexual identity, it's been covered very well, and my head is spinning like Linda Blair in trying to assimilate all that information. I don't like the word orientation because for 59 years I've been looking for the orientation to become a better homosexual, and I've never found that. So my sexual identity is like anyone else. We all have a sexual identity. And I challenge you to, I ask you to Google the heterosexual questionnaire with questions like, how long have you known you're heterosexual? Does your family know you're heterosexual? Do your friends know? Do your coworkers know you're homosexual? Or heterosexual, excuse me. Basically to say, turn it around and you'll feel through those questions what we feel throughout our lives, of living in closets to coming out to trying to survive. I must admit that everything I've heard so far applies beyond the age of 24. Most of everything continues beyond the age of 24. And sadly, the money has been in youth suicide prevention, and the dollars have not been there for LGBT suicide prevention and many things specific to our needs. In terms to gender identity and expression, we all have an identity. We all express our gender. We all have names for it, and it's not as simple as M and F, male and female. It's a fluid experience, and so I'm hoping people will Google this information, explore this information, and continue to learn. Next slide. Throughout life, there have been many distractions of culture, of national origin, of religious doctrine, the politics of gays, gods, and guns, the environment in which we grow up with families that have predetermined notions about such issues as one's sexual and or gender identity. And those things are pretty apparent, especially nowadays, as more and more media coverage, more and more movies, television shows are depicting real-life experiences of real people and characters that exemplify the spectrum of the alphabet soup. Next slide. The distortions are amplified by fear. We fear people, places, and things we don't know. We fear going to a grocery store in a neighborhood we're not familiar. Stigma is so disabling. Stigma is ignorance that results in discrimination, where people put themselves above others. Every person has trauma in their life, especially for me, the trauma of being a gay kid in Urbana, Ohio, and through that experience becoming internally homophobic in the sense that I covered by telling gay jokes and to protect my own identity. I admit to being transphobic as a gay man. And by the way, I didn't say that up front, that I am a proud gay man in the introduction. But transphobia is something I thought people were street workers and drag queens, and until I met people from the diverse, the just very diverse communities of people living various transgender conditions, situations, labels, et cetera, et cetera. And once I got to know people as people first, the transphobia left, and I'm so happy I was in the right places at the right time to learn. As far as the trauma, mental health treatment puts Band-Aids on trauma. We put Band-Aids on the surface stuff, and we don't realize that we need to dig deep and help people explore the traumas of their life that lead to the current situations in our life. Reparative therapy has been proven not to work, and our faith-based services that try to change the sexual orientation, gender identities of people. It's been proven to be very damaging by reports. States are taking action to eliminate reparative therapy from funding of health services, etc. And so that's, for the future, something we all need to be aware of, because they're influenced by the distractions and the cultures that we've learned and amplified by the distortions. And asylums, 25 years ago, we closed Philadelphia State Hospital. We're the 5th largest city without a state hospital. And yet, fast forward to today, there's a movement to reopen asylums. And so many people are in jails. America jails more people than any country in the world. So those are systemic issues that we fall into. Let me briefly just mention the new movement that has emerged over the years of people with lived experiences. And we all have lived experiences in every facet of our life. But the emergence of suicide attempt survivors and the way forward, the document through the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention and the Suicide Attempt Survivor Task Force. And let me say, under that same organization, the NAASP, there was an LGBT youth that I advocated harshly to become an LGBT task force that imploded, and so we have nothing to show, sadly, on a national basis for LGBT people. Another issue of dire advocacy concern. People are suicide loss survivors, and I fit the duality of both attempt survivor, and my last one was in the summer of 2000, and so it's not that far back in my past, but it's in the forefront of thoughts of trying to overcome, that desire. to find the willingness to live. And then it's very important to categorize people who die by suicide, who don't commit suicide, changing the language for dignity of people, to, just so how important it is to, to understand that we can't judge and label things, and we need to see it as in a different way. We all die, but why make it worse for families and the legacy of people? When somebody like, as an example, Robin Williams dies by suicide, we kind of shift our thinking in another way. I'd like to talk about allies and significant people in our lives that are essential in our duality of coming from sexual and gender identity communities. There's not one community. And it's been important for me to distinguish the biological and the logical families. Biological, well, we're born in families. The logical families are the chosen families. And so many people in all generations are separated logical and are lucky to find the logical families in our lives that will help us in the future. There are many slogans that I've learned to live by, such as silence equals death. Very powerful with the HIV/AIDS activism. And with that, knowledge is power. We can no longer keep people out of sight, out of mind, like we do in institutions, and as we do with people in the knowledge that they need to live with their health care, et cetera, et cetera. I coined the phrase voice equals life as a takeoff on silence equals death. Our voices equals life. Ask for help. Talk about it. How important that message is. Pride is contagious, and we celebrate it in pride parades and festivals. And the revolution that recovery is possible, that yet I underline that people with a mental illness die 25 years too young. Civil rights include, did I skip over SAMHSA? Okay, but hey, SAMHSA, if you go to their website, Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration,